this one was significant for many reasons, which we'll discuss sometime today. But the reason it was such an event is because it affected the village, and it was concentrated pretty much in this area. And because there are more people here, the effect seemed to be cumulative, and we felt it all. At any rate, I have to, Shirley Henry was mayor at the time, and she was supposed to be here moderating this for you. Unfortunately, she couldn't be here tonight, or to this afternoon, so I'm going to be Shirley. Don't get any ideas. Anyway,
You're surely not.
at any rate,
Wait for boys.
okay, so here, we'll start with the program. We have selected members of the board here. They all have to be directed, and they are going to volunteer some of their remembrances of their experiences during the flood. So, without further ado, the Pemberton Valley is so fertile due to the many floods it has experienced over the years. When I became the mayor of the village of Pemberton, one of the things that I went to Victoria for was to try to influence the government in reducing the flood construction levels that were imposed on building. I can well remember arguing with Victoria that there is no way you will see water that stretches from mountain to mountain in the valley. Well, I was proved wrong and lived to experience perhaps one of the most devastating floods in the valley, the flood of 1984. To share their involvement and experiences, I asked a variety of residents to join me this afternoon as we reflect on the flood of '84. The series of events started on Sunday in a remote location north of Pemberton. George Henry will now share his experiences as this catastrophe began to unfold on Sunday, October the 5th, 1984. Now, previous to this call that I got from Milt, it had been raining here, and it had been raining for days and days and days. In fact, there was a huge storm centered over Howe Sound, Whistler, Pemberton area, and it totaled to something like 312 millimeters of rain in about 5 or 6 days. So it was this total amount of water that was dropping and everything that caused this problem. And this went all the way up into the Meager, the Lillooet, melted snow at an unprecedented rate. At any rate, what happened was that on the Sunday, or it could have been Saturday night, but they received a call because there had been a massive slide and washout at Meager. And what had happened is that this torrent had come down and upset motorhomes, cars, and everything, and these people somehow got word out that they were stranded and they needed rescuing. So Milt asked me, he says, can you take a minibus up there and rescue these people? Now the paper reported 80 people, but it turned out there was only 18. So I, being fearless, much younger, I gave it my best, and I took the minibus and I started driving up there to rescue these poor souls who had lost their motorhomes and everything else. And it was raining. It was still raining. Now, the most sort of significant thing that was to me was the further up the valley I got, the higher the rivers came, and I was turned off at near Van Loon's and started up the forestry road towards Meager, and the water was right as high as the road. In fact, I thought if it goes up another couple inches more, it's going to flood the road, and I didn't really want to drive through a flooded road. I have dreams about that, driving through the water with not knowing where the road is. Anyway, we got to the Meager Creek crossing off the road, and the bridge was just above the water. You could just see an inch of wood above the flowing water, and that's quite high if you remember. So I bumped along, got to the thing, and those of you who remember, CRB had a workshop up there, which is an old A-frame. Well, pouring down rain, and these huddled wretches underneath the roof, because they wouldn't let them in the shop, They were sitting there out in the rain with their animals and their gear, and they're soaking wet. But they were there, and we finally got them onto the bus and started down the road. And of course, with the continuing rain, the levels were coming up, and by this time the water was running over that Meager Creek crossing. Back to Pemberton, and they had set up an emergency shelter at Signal Hill, and so they left them there. Well, they had dogs, and they had just miserable people, and they were wet, and they wanted to go home. But anyway, Bill phoned me again. He says, "Can you take these guys to Vancouver? They're really causing us a lot of problems." So I got my kid. Yeah, I got my kid, and we got the bus, fueled it up, went down to the school, loaded all of these people onto the bus, and headed off to Vancouver. Finally, we got there, dumped them out at 11:30. It was kind of funny. But anyway, we dumped them off, I think about 11:30 at night, and came back to Pemberton. But the next day, and this was Monday, the flood hadn't happened yet. We took it upon ourselves because I knew how high the rivers were in the North Country. So I went down to the airport, and I went over to where the old Red Bridge used to be on the Lillooet. And the water was right up to the tops of the dikes. And I think most people in the valley recognized that the river was so high it was just about to go over the top of the dike. Now, there's a peculiar thing that happens when you get a river that's flooding to that extent. The river crowns. And if you've never seen this, it's really quite frightening, because here's the water at your foot level, and you look out into the middle of the river, and it's 5, maybe 6 feet higher. It's almost eye-line time, and you can see this huge big bulge of water flowing down the middle of the river. And that really impressed me with how much energy and force and water there is in the river. And if you've seen it, you never forget it. At any rate, it was that night after the rescue that we were having the Thanksgiving, wasn't it?
Yes.
It was. It was
Yes, it
Thanksgiving
was.
Day. And we were all enjoying Thanksgiving dinner, and then it was in the evening that the waters started to rise. And it was then that they discovered that there had been several breaches in the dikes just north, in the north part of Pemberton. But the flood first started hitting in the upper valley, and one of the few farmhouses that was affected was Linda Ronan, now Welsh. At any rate, she wrote down her memories of that particular day, and I'm going to ask Nikki to read them.
I was asked to write about my experience with the flood of 1984. We had a massive rainstorm, and then steep creek slid and filled the bed of Ryan Creek, which in turn broke through the dike behind our farm. It happened on the Monday of Thanksgiving weekend, and I was thankful that we had celebrated with a turkey dinner on Sunday, because as it turned out, we had food in the fridge for a few days. My 4 children, ages 4 up to 10, and I watched out the living room window as the waters of Ryan Creek came across the fields toward our home. They were fussing, but I wasn't worried because there was a ditch between our field and our yard, and as well, the fields were about 3 feet lower than our garden. Well, the water kept rising, and when it leveled off, as it hit Meadows Road on the other side of the house, it was 3 feet deep in our yard. We had a below-grade basement and ended up with 6 feet of water in the basement for 6 days. We stood at the top of the stairs and watched it pour in under the door and up 2 steps above the landing. I spent hours hauling home canned fruits and jams up the stairs, as well as the contents of our freezers, which were full of vegetables from our garden and homegrown beef. My husband came in long enough to help get the small freezer upstairs so that I could reload it and cover it with blankets for insulation. I worked until the water was knee-deep, and then I quit, exhausted. The men had to get the cows to higher ground as they'd been out in one of the back pastures. To begin with, they were taken out onto the road and then walked a mile to another property we owned that was on higher ground. We'd been harvesting corn silage for our feed and still had a truckload which was used to feed them. Our potato crop was in the root cellar with a foot of water, and that resulted in a foot of rotten potatoes to pick through the following spring. There was all the hay in the barns to feed the cows for the winter. The big round bales sucked up water like shredded wheat. Our electricity had been turned off because we had various appliances underwater now. The power for the upper level of our home was later turned on so we could use the fridge, freezer, and stove. The furnace was in the basement, so the oven was our only source of heat. I remember piling more blankets on the beds as the days went by because it was so damp in the house and we couldn't keep warm. I remember Mike Ross coming down and canoeing up to the porch. He collected the kids and I and took us for a visit with Julia for a tea by the wood stove. What a treat to be warm for a while. And still it rained. We had the whole of Ryan Creek on our farm with nowhere to go. Our neighbors on both sides had higher ground, and Meadows Road is basically a dike for the Lillooet River. After several days of working to get Ryan Creek to turn back into its regular path, we now had to get rid of the standing water. My husband contacted the highways department and told them he was about to dig a trench through the road so our farm could drain into the Lillooet River. It cut off the Upper Valley people from town, but there was a plank put down so folks could walk across and have others meet them for a ride. When the water finally left, we had put a pump in the basement to suck the water out. The hay bales all had to be brought out of the barns, and the wet layers set out around the barnyard. One barn had a cement floor, and as the last bales were brought out, there were puffs of smoke where the wet hay was self-combusting. Our cleanup took weeks, and I'll never forget my friends who came and scrubbed silt off rough studs in the unfinished basement and washed bags of clothes that were stored downstairs seasonally. Linda Welch.
This is Shirley again. It was Monday evening that the village council had an extraordinary meeting and declared Pemberton a disaster area, which allowed Victoria to provide assistance. As the residents became surrounded by water, many took refuge with friends on higher ground or in the village at the United Church, the Hotel, Legion, some of the only dry areas. The fire hall became the command post. Now what happened with the flood, because it doesn't really mention it here, is that the water breached the dikes up in the upper area, and I think it was up around McEwen somewhere. And it came coursing through this the field by Shores and Picades and through that area, and it came roaring through here, and it stopped up against the railway trestle. Now, years and years ago, the trestle was on pilings because they anticipated that if the river did flood, the water would just throw through the pilings and keep everything normal. But in their wisdom and in a cost-saving measure, they filled it and created a dam. And one of our residents, the people that lived in Pemberton North were quite perturbed with this whole situation. And one of them, Herb Bluer, was a fiery little guy, but he was affected with it, and he was one of the people that said, "Look, you don't do something with that, we're going to get dynamite and we're going to blow this thing up and to let the water out." And there was a fact to this, but the railway did contribute to this problem by putting in this fixed trestle instead of having the original pilings. All right, many of the volunteers themselves flooded out, spent many hours preparing meals for the evacuees. And one of those volunteers was Flo Bilenduke. Flo's going to tell us about her experiences with the flood and dealing with people. That everybody in the valley that had a dry place was pretty much committed to doing something for them. Okay, take it away, Flo.
Well, my residence is right off the dike on Fraser Road, and it was right at the end. We were asked, my daughter and I, because my husband and youngest son were in Fall River at the time, if we would help sandbag. And so there was Heinz Searcher with his tractor, bringing sand. His wife Sylvia, who was due to have a baby at any time, sitting on a wooden box. My daughter and I were filling sandbags and getting them ready to put on. There was a curve in the river, and when the high water comes, it doesn't want to make that turn. So we had to dike it with sandbags. We had one native boy from Mount Currie, and I can't remember his name after all this time. He was putting these bags in place. My daughter and I were helping him, and then Heinz, whenever he could spare time, would come and help us. Then that night, because it continued to rain, well, we had that big early snow, and when that came down, and then it warmed up, and it was raining on like the ice and that at the top. The water was higher and higher. Actually, Wally Erickson was coming into our yard and checking the water level every hour all night long. I remember, I'd hear that truck come and my heart would just sink, Anyway, it's about 10 o'clock the next morning. They came and they said that we had to evacuate. And so my daughter and I left with the vehicles and went into town. I get into town, and Betty Connell saw us, and she said, are you evacuated? And we said yes. And she said, well, you'll come and stay with me. She took my daughter and I in, and she said, if you'll share a bedroom, I have a cot that Sherry can sleep in. And then she had the Blackstocks, who were the people that were right at the head of Clover Road when you turn to go towards the river. They were staying there. And there was another couple, they were downstairs, and then Betty had her own room. And then Sherry got called to work at the garage because she worked there as a teenager. And she was pumping gas for everyone that needed it as long as it lasted. And I went up to the United Church basement, and Adele Drenka and myself made a big pot of homemade soup, and we had stuff for sandwiches and that, and we worked there feeding the fellows from that were working and needed to be fed. The outcome of it all was my land was not flooded. It's higher. The houses down at the end of Fraser Road, the water was up almost to the top of the cars and that. And but one thing that really saddened me, I spent 10 years in high school library. There was over 15,000 books in that library, and they all went. The water was as high as the buses, and the library was full to the ceiling. So, anyway, that was my part in the flood of '84.
I was just talking to the safety inspector out here a while back, and he asked me a question about fatalities, and I said, well, we were pretty lucky in spite of all of this deep water. We only had one fatality, but when you think that the water was out to the Rocks Bluff just on the highway here, that's where it stopped, and it went all the way up to the high school where it was 8-9 feet deep, and it at the end of the street here, is this Prospect?
Yeah.
Prospect Street, at the houses at the end, John Barr lived in there, and he had his boat stuffed up underneath his carport because the water was that high. And they were out water skiing in this field here. It was really, really quite incredible. The water went to Poplar Street, halfway up. The houses at the far end, eastern end, some of them got some water damage, but the upper ones didn't. So it was quite an event. But the one thing that did happen then, Brent Pipe used to have, where these condos are located, just behind us here, he used to have a couple of old shacks which he called residential living. And he actually lived in one for a while. But these were in the low part, and of course they got flooded. Well, the only fatality happened when one of the residents fell asleep on his couch, and he fell off his bed in the deep water and drowned. And that was the sole fatality, I think, in the whole program. At any rate, we Pemberton, this part up Pemberton North was hit the worst. The high school was hit. People around in that low-lying area. Mount Currie also had water, but theirs was not from this deluge that came sweeping across the valley. Theirs was from water backing up on the Birkenhead a little bit and coming back. Georgina was there. She is going to tell you about her experiences with the water.
Seems like nothing, but it was plenty then. And I had a house over the Little River Bridge and one in Mount Currie, both with basements, and it was the water that came back. The lake just couldn't take those three rivers. And I thought, you look in the driveway, there's a bit of water, so I took the vehicle out on the road. It was high, and in 20 minutes you're walking up with water up there. Yeah, and we went up to the lodge, because Watson's had the lodge then, and we stayed in the cabin. But you couldn't get through the road at Mount Currie, because at that corner there by the Spirit Circle it was flooded. And so you think, you know, you don't know what's happening at home. Finally, when we did come home, we had to go in the house with a boat. And then the mess, because both basements. So you came to Pemberton and you got these heavy, heavy pumps. You could hardly lift them. And then you put them, there were gas on the porch, and you couldn't suck it out all at once, because they said your basement would collapse if you sucked. So you sucked some of the water, and then you took the pump off and some of the other. And both basements, had to do both basements, and the mess that's left. And the compensation, if you rented a house, you couldn't get anything because you had renters in there. And if you owned a place, you could only claim up to $10,000. So you lose your washer, your dryer, everything that's in the basement, and all your winter supply of wood, but you can't claim for anything because it doesn't come to $10,000. And then you had to go and get buckets and buckets of this bleach that they provided. And Pemberton, I don't know, you mentioned that, they had a big lost and found place here in Pemberton, and you could go and look for all your stuff, the Pemberton people that floated away. There was everything in there. Yeah, you could look for all your stuff. And it was frightening, and you could see years after, you could go in your yard and you could see the line of the water, you know, and what had actually happened. So I hope it doesn't happen again. Yes.
Back to Shirley again. It was after this, one thing that was kind of interesting is they set up the command center at the fire hall, which is now above the fire hall. And Milt and Shirley became, they had a Russ McIntyre, I think, from the PEP in Victoria. They came over and they pretty much ran an emergency program for about 4 days, and bringing in all sorts of help and expertise and just guiding people around. But it was pretty hectic for a while. Shirley makes one note here is that right after the flood, the water started to recede. Yeah, the cleanup problem became the real issue. What could you do with this mess that was left behind? Like, some places had a little bit of sediment, other people had lots of sediment, but what we all had, if we were in the way of the path of the flood, was all of the accumulation of cow dung and pesticides, and everything that the farmers had lying around there came floating down and got deposited in these people's houses. And it made an incredible mess.
Liquid manure.
It was just super toxic stuff. And Laurie's going to mention that because the school was particularly affected with that. At any rate, here's one of the steps after when they started the cleanup. Shirley reflects on this. It was just a year earlier, in 1983, that the village of Pemberton granted freedom of the village to one combat engineer regiment from Chilliwack. Now, what's interesting about that is that the Army she knew some people from the military, and they used to have that huge military base in Chilliwack. So and they were looking for a place to do their army maneuvers. Where they used to go was up at the Chilcotins. So they were looking for some place a little closer to home, which was going to reduce the cost of driving. You have to remember, the Canadian Army was still using World War II equipment, so I mean, to take it more than 100 miles was taking a real chance. So anyway, they made an arrangement with the village. The village would sort of accommodate them and make clear all the hurdles. And they, for years, came up here and did army maneuvers, and they would build bridges and do all sorts of sort of work in lieu of paying rent. So the village granted them freedom of the village, which means that they had license to enter the village at any time and pillage and rape and plunder at their will. And they have a declaration to prove it. They never did it, but they were welcome. And it was quite a unique opportunity because for the army. Anyway, she called the favor in. Yeah. You guys have freedom in the village. Get your butts up here and help us out. And as she says, I was not always one to follow protocol. But she's nicer than I am. She says, I called up the army base in Chilliwack and requested that the regiment come to Pemberton to help with the flood cleanup. I was told later this was not the way to get the army involved, but too bad, they came anyway. After all, they did have the freedom of our village. They came fully equipped with tents, kitchen, and many able-bodied men to assist with the cleanup, particularly at the high school. And which takes us to our next part, which we had two schools here affected by the flood. One was severely damaged. The other one had just minor water in it. But Laurie Laursen, who happened to be working with the maintenance people at the time, was charged with one of the major tasks of getting the cleanup done, and he wants to tell you some of his recollections of that particularly trying time for that school. Laurie.
Okay, thank you, people. Well, to start off, the maintenance people and custodians, 6 of them lived past Mount Currie up towards Darcy. So the first day we couldn't get down because they were afraid we'd drive through Mount Currie and run off the road. So they wouldn't let us in, so we went home. But anyway, we got down, and meanwhile the electrical inspector had come in because of all the electricals in the school, and he wouldn't let anybody do any work in there whatsoever with power tools until I checked all the baseboard outlets in the whole school, and I only found 2 of them there that weren't safe. So I made a special instrument for this purpose. But and we, like the custodian people and the board sent up wet dry vacuums and whatnot, but we made wooden squeegee to push the mud out the doors. That's how bad it was. There was that much mud on the floors. But anyway, and of course the first thing, as I say, the first thing I had to do was try and get the furnace going. Well, there was 6 feet of water still in the furnace room because it was all lower. And that, oddly enough, all our electrical panels in that school were all above the flood level. Water never hit any of them. The only one that got hit was the panel in the furnace room because it was down below. I had to replace all the breakers, and then I finally got the thing going. And of course, all our circulating pumps were all full of water and silt, and gradually I just took them off one at a time and got them running again, and I got some heat into the school and whatnot because of the high water level. It had all gone into the insulation and the walls and whatnot, and I had to strip every wall down in that school and replace it. And all the fridges, the stoves, and the sewing machines and all that got all wet and whatnot. They were just disposed of. Well, we had them over in the maintenance shop. Unfortunately, our maintenance shop, our furnace was hung from the ceiling, so we had heat. We had that much water in the that had run out, and we lost, I think we lost 3 school buses. Because any vehicle that had water above the dashboard were written off, and of course all our service vehicles were gone too. So we ended up using our own vehicles to go around. And one of the fortunate things that happened with that school, there was no well or anything like that. We were on the Pemberton North water system, and we had clean drinking water, and they had the washrooms, that were available. And the board brought in, I think it was 4, or was it 6, George?
6.
Yeah, 6 portable classrooms. Well, Pat Grape, who was one of the local electrical contractors, set up a temporary electrical system, and then these classrooms are all wired up and whatnot, and they had like roofs over the arcades so that the students could go down and use the washrooms and whatnot in the school. But, it was pretty bad. But another fortunate thing is that all our electrical panels, the big heavy-duty ones, were all up in a room up above the stage in the gymnasium. And nothing got damaged. So we were able to bring the school ahead pretty quick. But all things considered, and there was a heck of a lot, as Flo mentioned, there were people, cooking and whatnot. Well, my first wife, we lived up in Burton, and I had just bought her a brand new truck and whatnot, and she was cooking up food and stuff like that, bringing it down with her little truck and whatnot, and serving it in the Legion. She was one of the Legion ladies, and then she was also part of the WI. So this all helped, and it's surprising how many people pitched in, and helped out with everything. People came in, they volunteered, came up from the coast and everything else. So anyway, that's about all I've got to say.
The Army came, but as Georgina reminds us, the Mennonites, I think they're from Abbotsford, they came up here. There were quite a contingent of them, and they were skilled carpenters, tradespeople, and they assisted homeowners with the sort of cleanup and refurbishment of their houses so they could get back in and live with them. Probably this flood was precipitated or sort of pushed over the edge from I told you about the 110 inches or 110 millimeters of rain that fell in 24 hours. Well, I mean, that's not all that much rain. It's about 5 inches. But when it comes down on top of an already flooded situation, then that's just a different set of stuff. So Shirley says, she did some thing here. The damage estimated by the federal government, emergency planning, was $3.99 million. And in today's dollars, that would be 8.9 million. Yeah. So it's a considerable sum that these people experienced. A lot of that was in the school, but when you consider the other residents, barns, loss of crops, it was a lot. Damage included property damage to farmers' crops, personal damage to residents, high school damage, which the high school was completely gutted and rebuilt, and of course replacement of the buses. Loss of animals, you saw them on the screen there, huddled on those little high spots. Road damage. Airport was underwater. Dikes damaged. They all had to be repaired. The water was contaminated with many unknown chemicals, including the sewage, pesticides, herbicides, and many other things. The cleanup was dirty. They had a fire hall full of bleach where you could get a 5-gallon bucket of bleach just for the asking. One of the things that they also didn't mention was that BC Rail had a derailment of 15 to 17 cars as the tracks were washed out. And they were submerged along the banks of the Little River just in the north here. And the flood affected Tarley Valley from Upper Meadows to Lillooet Lake. And Pemberton wasn't the only community affected, so was Whistler and Squamish, but they didn't have that dramatic sort of surge that we did. Theirs was more localized damage and spotty. The torrential rains that were relentless left their mark in our region and took many years to recover. There are many memories for me as mayor. The media were ever present, The one thing that will always stick in my mind is that many nursing mothers lost their milk from all the stress. We had a fire chief, Milt Fernandez, who didn't sleep for days as he oversaw the emergency. The village had previously been working on a disaster plan, so we were somewhat organized, but not for the size of the disaster that was happening to us. We were thankful that Victoria sent in Ross McIntyre to be our emergency coordinator for the whole area. Thank you to the presenters today. I know there are many more memories, and we could talk on for days.
I'd like to know what happened to the animals. Did you?
A lot died. A lot died. Some drowned. They starved to death. And so after it was all over, they went around with trucks and front-end loaders, and they loaded them into trucks and took them off. And I'm not sure if they burned them or buried them, but they disposed of them. Yeah, there were quite a few animals died.
One of the things that I remember too, living up the valley, is that we didn't have the media and the way of communicating that we do today, and so we couldn't get out of our house. And I mean, I remember canoeing over to Shires, and the current was so strong. You were canoeing for all your worth to get across the fields, and we were windsurfing, but you were desperate for information because you couldn't get to town. You didn't know what's happening. So every time somebody would come along, there'd be a short stretch, and somebody would come along, you'd just be like, "What's happening now?" Because you really had no idea what was going on, and there wasn't the media that there is today. And telephones. I think the telephones were out for.
They were
quite a while.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you were, and so of course, Pemberton being Pemberton, the rumors were unbelievable. It was some interest.
Everything being in the high ground in Pemberton was sort of protected. One of the interesting things, we're going through our research, and we discovered a report written by an engineer in 1858, I think. And one of the things that he recommended in his report is that a village be established at the foot of the creek near Pemberton, as it is one of the only high spots and flood-proofed areas in the whole valley. So that was recognized way back, 100 some odd years.